Good to have you back for what happens to be our 190th episode of ThinkTech Hawaii's Humane Architecture. And we continue to look at more tropical integrity through tensegrity. And we're having back our utmost expert for that, who's Larry Medlin back in Tucson, Arizona. Hi, Larry.
Morning, Martin.
Good to have you back. And we're going to jump right into where we started, where we stopped last time, where we were talking about that right after when Frei Otto and you had been experimenting in the most impressive way and built my cultures, where I'm broadcasting from, by the way, from Germany, near Munich. You've been building the pavilion of our country in Montreal in 1967. And you wanted to prove yourself, both of you, above and beyond, to say we can do more. This system is too attractive to just apply it to these sort of niche typologies. We want to apply it to, which is increasingly the largest challenge of mankind, is to provide shelter for dignity and decency. So you went on to wanting to demonstrate that, but you started out not with a theory, but just like the spider in this sort of natural way of learning by doing, and we're doing sort of real size and scale and live prototyping, right?
Yes, that's what we see here in this first slide. This is actually a series of projects that was an experimental structure of a three-dimensional space net that was built with a group of students between the time period of 1967 and 1973 on a wooded campus area of Washington University in St. Louis. We built two structural elements. We built the space net, which we're going to talk about here now right away. And then we also built below that a tension structure, which we will look at later as well.
Okay, so for that, let's jump to the next slide and walk us through the process of this great reciprocity of thinking and making, Larry.
Well, first, if you look at the upper right-hand image, a diagram of this picture, you see the overall view. There was two large trees, so we took advantage of those to be able to construct and hang a cable sling that got us started in the whole process of making a suspended structure from that point. And then we hung the space net down below it, which you see also in a theoretical sectional diagram of how it could be enclosed below, which is also the second study, the studying of the idea of all the architectural and planning and safety issues and so forth that would be involved in making a space net an actually livable and usable structure. A very important part of this process is by the measuring table that you see on the left. And if you look at the slide with it, there's a detail of how you go into that with an image of the measuring table. And below on the left side, you also see, we did it with basic materials. You see washers were our connecting joints and stuff, simply precisely drilled out and repetitive. It wasn't anything high tech. It was what we could use. You see, even in the images of the cable net, it was standard cable clamps and things like that that were commercially available to us so we could get started. So what we see here is the overall view of a measuring table, which is about 5 feet by 7 feet inside, and it's raised up. And inside that, if you look very carefully, you can see that's the space net model that we built. After we had it built, then we had to be able to measure it and then be able to fabricate it and plot it. And so that's what we worked from to do that. And then on the right-hand part of the image is a detail that right in the middle is a marble measuring plate. And then there's a big C-shaped arm, which you can see on the left, that goes over with a counterbalance. And right behind the point on that, the upper part is a point where iron on the right is putting a little dot to indicate a point. And then precisely below that is a plumb line that's hanging down to a point. And Michael Rubenstein, a Washington University student, is making sure that's hitting the precise point that we want to measure. So when he tells me it's there, I make a dot to establish it and plan, and then we take that thing over to the arm where we have a vertical measurement, and we plot exactly what that vertical dimension is. So that's a way that we can systematically plot all points in three-dimensional space, and also by moving the device around, we can plot a series of contours and make an actual contour drawing of the model.
Yeah, and putting this into perspective for the audience, we're talking the late 60s, and that was the time of the analog. And maybe we're throwing in the name of your collaborator and friend, Eberhard Haug, and tell us a little bit about his pioneering work to that regard.
So my point was that this project, the Museum of Modern Art project, the project for Crown Center in Kansas City, were all hand measured drawings to lay it out, not only for that, but for, as you see in the model below in the drawing in the center, there's little linen strips that we use to plot and establish the patterns for the surfaces and so forth. So, but then Eberhard Haug, who I mentioned earlier, was the engineer that worked at the IL in Stuttgart throughout the whole process of doing the development for the German Pavilion. And when we look at that bigger model, you may or may not remember there's a whole series of strain gauges on that to be able to study what the stress in the wires were under the deflection of weights or simulated wind load asymmetrical conditions and so forth. So after that period of time, there also were some basic computer programs available. And a computer program tried to plot out the form, and it produced a drawing. It took about 2 weeks to get that done under what was available then. It took us about a week to get this precisely done for the German Pavilion. And the hand drawing was much more accurate than at that time. So because of that, Eberhard Haug said there's got to be a way to update computer methods and use these in a much more reliable way to produce these kinds of drawings and measurements. So he went to do a PhD at Berkeley, which he completed successfully with T.Y. Lind, where a very well-known engineer there. And he developed the first basic sort of programs to study the stress and the distribution in the actual forms. It's sort of the process is a little bit analogous. If you consider a drum skin and you put the drum skin on the drum skin and you just put it on there, you're going to probably observe that it's not very taut in one direction and it's very too taut in the other direction. So the correction is you relax that in the taut direction and pull it tauter in the not so taut direction. And you keep going through a series of iterations until finally you get the correct dimension where the drum skins sketch out evenly all the way through. And that's basically the same process that's used in the programs that Eberhard developed for a computer model to make both drawings that you can measure the shape and form and actually help resolve those to get equal attention throughout it by looking at its curvatures and so forth. And so the Tensile membrane programs were later used for things like, I remember there was a Davis Cup going on, and he did some of the patterning for the sails and that was one of those early programs that he developed. You could also look for where to place stress and reinforcing a nuclear reactor back in those days by doing a stress analysis. So I kept working with the membranes, and then eventually he was able to actually use a more sophisticated iterative program to do things like do skin graphs. For example, skin is a tensile element. It has different tensions in one direction than the other, but he could enter that into his program and go through a series of iterations and actually mock up how much skin you would need and where it should come from and try a test so that theoretically, to make a long story short, you could mock up and do trial examinations of more than 2 or 3 different strategies to approach that need. And so that's what his programs were used for. And then after that, he added compression to that So when you could do tension and compression, these programs then were used for automobile crash tests and things like that. So very sophisticated things that he had a group of, they had an office in Paris. His firm was himself and 3 of his Berkeley candidates who were Frenchmen that they worked together for many years developing all of this advanced technology that was used for all these almost unimaginable uses than just simply trying to find out how to stretch out a tensile membrane properly.
That's amazing. Yeah, it reminds me of an upcoming show with DeSoto Brown and Ron Lindgren about automobiles, and you had some visit from Detroit to that regards, right? At some point.
Well, Everhart was teasing me, sort of. His programs were first he did radial tires and all that stuff, and first he worked with the European companies, all tire companies, and then he
Was that
worked
Michelin, maybe?
Michelin and Renault and what Pirelli and what's the
Yeah.
French? I forget the French tire company, but anyhow, but then he started working with the automobile companies. Literally, first were the French companies. Renault was the first one I think he worked with. Then he worked with the German companies, and then he called. This is where Detroit comes in. He called me up and said, "Well, finally, you Americans are smart enough to use my crash test program, so they don't have to build and crash eight cars to get the same results they can do after modeling it on my computer programming and then building one model as a final check."
Yeah, and per the old saying, Larry, of God or the devil being in the detail, we also have a couple of connections here. So what always amazes me, and I'm repeating myself, is this sort of continuity of between the thinking and the making, and that unlike conventional architecture where things have to get more abstracted, the smaller they get, the more representative they get. Here, it's almost like you're always working in the same scale. It just gets bigger and bigger and bigger, right? So on the right side are actually the actual details of the completed prototyping, right?
Exactly. That's what you see on the left column is the model. The model just to the left of the right column is where you can see we used washers and soldered wire to figure out the wire links for the space net and fix them into a position. And then the middle one is we use a simple bolt for the base pivot point, and then the edge point where the cables at the bottom came out that were what were used to pull to stress the cable net and pull it taut after it was fabricated and make any adjustments. You see there's the middle cable that goes right through the middle, and then a right cable curves off to the right, which is now right behind the illustration. There we go. Now you can see that, and then you see that actual point in the field when we were doing it on the area in Washington University in St. Louis.
Yeah, and the nature, I guess the beauty of that is that you were involved in all of that as sort of the Larry of all trades. You shared with us how you were making the intricate little models and your accidents and incidents you had with that. And then they also sent you up high to the real thing. And let's go to the next slide, right? Because that's you up there too at the top right.
Actually, it's me up there first at the top left, at the top of the mast, up there, attaching that to the sling cable, so that we begin to make a connection between the sling that came from the tree that I mentioned before, and now this is actually putting it in as a supporting element for the whole SpaceNet experiment that we're doing. And those are the connections that I was making that we saw the details for that in the previous slide. And then once the SpaceNet, we did that on both sides, of course. And then once we had that sling, we could begin to fabricate a SpaceNet. And we did that by raising up prefabricated vertical panels, first doing a middle panel, then the panel to the left of that and to the right of that, working outward until we got it balanced and got the sling to take its final shape. And that's what you see me doing on the right, is actually raising up one of the first of those interior panels.
And now I think we can say it's fair to say is the true tradition of the old Baumeister tradition, the master builder, Where unlike today, where you just don't figure things out and you make other people do it, right? Here it's like, well, get up there. I think that's what you told me. They just told you, well, get up there and do it, right? Might as well. Learning by doing.
Some of the students were a little bit nervous about doing that. I said, all right, I'll do it. And we didn't have any problems after that.
There you go. Good raw model. And next slide, let's look at, how that continued here.
Yeah, so
You guys up.
that's after we've got those vertical panels hanging, which included the lateral panels going front and back and up and down. And then we had to put in the lateral panels. So that's what you see we're doing. We're actually hanging on one of the vertical panels, taking our weight, and then threading in lateral cables. And then on the right is after we got further along in that process, and we're starting to tighten up the clamps and fix the cable net into its final configuration, which was actually done in three-dimensional space.
Okay, that makes us hungry for more. Let's go to the next slide and see how you guys progress.
All right, well, that's, you saw on the slides in the previous slide what I was just talking about, how we raised up the vertical panels, and then we started to put in the lateral panels. And then when we had it finished, we tensioned the whole system by pulling down on 6 points, 2 major points at the ends. And that's what you see being done on the lower part of the slide. See, there's a 145-pound young man, David Despang, with a long device, a winching device, was able to put a few tons of tension on that apex point to pull the space net into tension.
Yeah, truly collaborative. Another of your friends and collaborators is Jurgen Hennike. You want to mention him maybe as well?
Jurgen Hennike worked for the IL right after the German Pavilion time, and he worked as the administrative director of IL, leading all the research and so forth, along in collaboration with Burkhardt, who was doing the administration. And for many years, he oversaw the research, met with students that came in from the University of Stuttgart to the IL in Stuttgart, and has traveled around the world giving seminars and workshops and building prototypical structures.
Yeah. And since we also going to use the show to have you reconnect to Eberhard and Jurgen. So guys, you will be talking to Larry again soon. And just by the nature of this sort of beast, just like the spider, who's probably the closest animal species to you guys, the spider doesn't theoretically figure out to make its net, right? It starts through learning by doing, right? And so you guys, again, before you even started to think big about how you can use the system to house people, you figured out how the nitty-gritties of it are. But then, and only then, you moved on to envision large structures. And that's what we're going to return to, next slide, and where we had been already briefly, and saying this is now a suggestion of what we like to call applied research, right? What do you apply it to? And that's what you suggested, right? Large-scale housing based on suspended systems.
Yes, this is a project called Space Nets, where I mentioned at the onset that we wanted to, people just say, well, that's interesting, but you could never use that for a building. So we wanted to literally do all the details and study all the issues of safety and structure and so forth like that. So, and we were very fortunate was that in Clayton, Missouri, which is a major suburban area that has rapidly become a major sort of social, cultural, governmental center for that satellite urban community in West St. Louis. The team of urban planning students at Washington University had done an urban design study that made very specific recommendations about how a facility was needed that would provide dwellings and office spaces and social cultural spaces and have places for bigger public event elements and structures to be built in and around and about it. and make a linkage between two major elements in that area. The new governmental center, which is on the right of this image, and off to the left, the major park that was used for all kinds of recreational activities.
Yeah. And it's true sort of performative gestalters versus increasingly more formalist designers of these days. You were basically figuring this out from inside out. And let's go to the next slide that basically shows us that it's based on the small cell, the human occupational enclosure, and the places and spaces you designed here, right? Let's talk about these a little bit.
Well, the SpaceNet created a grid that was basically about 18 feet spacing apart. And so the system consisted of vertical hanger panels and lateral cables that stabilized those hanger cables in place. And so we could prefabricate all of these components and simply slide them in from the outside. And you see there's basically, there's a full sort of panel that you see is the biggest thing with a frame around in the middle. There's an exterior door window panel, as you see there. And there's also an exterior terrace panel. And then there's a half panel. So that was our vocabulary of elements, those four basic elements that you could put together. What we see here are, as I mentioned earlier, we wanted to not just build a space net and have people say, well, what value, what meaning does that have for anything? And that it, you could never build that or use that. So we did this case study, and we wanted to show that you could inhabit this and satisfy all safety and building codes and all those kinds of issues to make it a viable architectural entity. So the SpaceNet consisted of a vertical hanger cables and then longitudinal and lateral cables that stabilize those cables in place. And that created 18-foot wide SpaceNet bays, and then a series of prefabricated panels. In the lower left, you see the diagram of those. The panels consisted of an outdoor terrace panel, a wall panel for connection between inside and outside, a full panel, which was 18 feet by 16, I believe, and a half panel, which is half of that you see on the end. So with those elements, we could create all the plans that you see over here in the diagrams on the right, just showing that you could do a 1-bedroom, a 2-bedroom, a 1-story, 2-story. And also, if you look at the grouping in the middle and the upper part, you'll see that there's, whereas on ones on the outside are simply in one bay of the SpaceNet grid, this one actually punches through it so that you have a plan spread out over 2 bays of the SpaceNet grid.
Yeah, very nice diversity for different, sizes of families, for different lifestyles. Go to the next slide where we see a couple more of these, and we also see their sectional quality here.
So over here, on the side, we see what I was just talking about in plan. You see how the units are in the upper right, they're stacked, and you see the balcony deck comes out, so that provides shade for the lower area below it. And also by accomplishing that, by providing shade, it also provides visual privacy, so you can't actually look at the person's private space down below. You see that also shown in the center slide. In these sections, you can sort of see that they can either work as 1-story or 2 stories. So the access is an exterior corridor that runs the entire length of the building, and on one level, and that's always the public side, the living room side. And then that reserves the south side, or in this case, the sun side most of the time, for the private area and the views and the outdoor personal space.
Yeah, and that's also shown very well in the next slide here, in this diagram, which shows all the elements here. And in the description here, you talk about cross ventilation, you talk about shades, you talk about sunlight, you talk about daylight efficiency, and all these things. So very progressive. And only down there in the offices, I was reading that you suggested them to be air conditioned. And that's fair and fine, because we're talking just zeitgeist and era-wise, we're talking just before the big rain check of the first oil crisis, right? So after that, people were way more sensitive about these bioclimatic systems, but you were pioneering to that degree because you believed in them even at the peak of believing in fossil fueled air conditioning. And you didn't sell out on that one. You wanted to dwell on natural systems.
Well, I'd like to comment that cross ventilation was a key element in all of those. All the residential units were one-sided except for the one floor, So there was a way to have cross ventilation in the two-story units. You could have it from one floor and down to the lower floor and the upper floor.
Absolutely. Next slide. This is showing in plan what you described before. I mean, the lines are basically the base of the cables, and then you see how it's basically nested into that structure, right? So that's the typical, actually the office floor plan of it at the lower levels, with these very kind of typical for the 70s, the kind of the Großraumbüro, the large space kind of offices with the islands in there. And so that was sort of I mean, it seems to me as a scape, as an office scape here. And then we can go to the next slide. And you also, you worked in a multimodal and multimedia way. So here you went back to mass modeling, right?
Yeah, this is where, on the left, we see just the basic space net. To build that, that's actually built out of a wire model. And then you see that later adapted using blocks to put built elements into it. And then you see a more sophisticated version of that, of building a model for a grouping of space net structures that we later assembled and put and made a proposal to respond to the urban design plan that I mentioned earlier in Clayton, Missouri.
With that, I think we're getting to the end of the show, Larry, only to next week to continue with this exciting research application of a fantastic housing project. And until then, please tighten your tropical integrity of tensegrity. And thanks, Larry, for having been on the show again.
Auf Wiedersehen, Martin. Dankeschön.
Tschüss, bis nächste Woche. See you all next week. Bye-bye.